Hi there, my name is Andrew Carroll, and I'm the founder and director of the Center for American War Letters at Chapman University. And our whole mission is to preserve the wartime correspondence written by our service members and their families. And what I want to talk to you about is why we do this. I actually don't come from a military family, but this project began for very personal reasons. My sophomore year of college, our house in Washington, D.C. burned down, and everything we had was lost. Several days after the fire, a distant cousin of mine who had served in World War II called to see how we were doing and just to check in. And I said, well, the good news is that nobody was hurt, but we lost everything, all of our letters and photos and all that personal memorabilia that means so much. And he said, I was just going through my World War II correspondences, and I came across something I want to share with you. And I got this letter in the mail a few days later. It was written on April 21st, 1945. Jim was just a young P-51 pilot. He was writing to his wife, Betty Ann. And the very first sentence really caught my attention. He says, "I saw something today that makes me realize why we're fighting this war." And he goes on 3 very descriptive pages about walking through Buchenwald, the Nazi concentration camp. And he's describing to his wife in explicit detail what he saw. And I was just thunderstruck by this letter. And I called Jim back and thanked him for sharing it. And I said, of course I'll return this to you. And he said, you know what, keep it. I probably would have ended up throwing it out anyway. And that just really struck a chord that we would have lost something so valuable to history. So I ended up writing to a syndicated columnist named Dear Abby, asking her if she could help me launch a nationwide initiative to save America's war letters. And so November 11th, Veterans Day, 1998, her column went out in newspapers across the country. And we were flooded with responses, thousands upon thousands of letters from every war in America's history. And the main question we get is, why the focus on letters? The first thing I think is just so important about these correspondences is just the tangible quality, that you're looking at and holding the actual paper that these individuals also held generations, centuries beforehand. This is a letter written in the early days of the American Revolution, and it's as legible and as clear and clean as the day it was written, almost 240 years ago. This letter we recently received is from the Civil War, and it's by a young Union soldier who was captured and taken to Andersonville, and he's telling his wife that he would come home safely. But this letter was kept in an attic, and we can tell that mice had actually eaten around the sides of it. And this is part of the reason why we want to save these correspondences and preserve them for posterity. What's also great about letters is you get these little embellishments that really you can't find in any other type of communication. This is a letter by a young airman who was going to become a cartoonist for Disney after the war. And he embellished his letters with these beautiful sketches he did. And he was complaining to his friend, who was also in the Army Air Corps, that he wasn't seeing any action. As it turned out, this is the last letter he wrote before he was killed. Letters meant so much to service members that they went to really almost every length possible to write home and to receive mail. This is actually a letter written on toilet paper from Vietnam by a Marine who had no other recourse except for this paper that was on hand. We also received this letter by a young woman who was called a WAC. It was the Women's Auxiliary Corps in the Army. And she was writing to her fiancé. And the way she was notified that he himself had been killed in action was her letter was returned with the words "deceased" written on it. We have another extraordinary letter by a woman who served in the Persian Gulf War. And this is the last conflict in which handwritten letters were the main form of communication. And she begins, "Dear Mom, we're 5 days into war. Amazing, isn't it? It's been some trying times in the past 5 days. I'm sure there'll be many more before I leave here." She then goes on to write, "If I ever had any doubts about weather," and then the letter cuts off right there. And it says, "Next PM, back again." In the middle of that sentence, we had a Scud missile attack. And what I love about the letter writer, her name was Sandy Mitten, and she was actually a grandmother when she wrote this. She was known as the Gulf War Granny, and she was serving on a naval vessel manning a .50 caliber machine gun in the Persian Gulf. Although most of the people we have are not well known, every so often we get someone who does become somewhat famous after the war. This is a letter written during the Korean conflict, and it's by a man named Dr. Richard Hornberger, and he was writing back to his parents about serving in a MASH unit. When he came home after the war, using his letters and his memoirs, he wrote the book MASH, which of course became the film and then the TV series. And finally, with respect to just the physical significance of these letters, is they really give you a sense of the life and death circumstances under which these troops are living. This is a letter written from Anzio, 1944, by a World War II soldier. He was describing to a friend a near miss he had, where a shell dropped right next to him, but didn't explode. He put the letter in his rucksack, and then he was shot through the back hours later. Fortunately, he survived, but you can see the bullet hole and the burn marks right in the middle of the letter. What's so important about these letters, too, is their historical value. They capture history the way almost nothing else can. We have a letter by a young sailor named William Seiko, and this is written on USS New Orleans stationery, and it begins, "Dear Sis, it is now 9:05 a.m. Sunday morning, and we've been bombed for over an hour." You look at the upper right-hand corner, December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. He is inside that ship as the attack is happening. And he describes in vivid detail about hearing men screaming and rushing around for their gas masks. And he's trapped in the forward engine room. So all he can do is wait it out as he writes this 33 handwritten page letter home. And fortunately, he survived, which is why we have the letter and his incredible experience. At the end of World War II in Europe, a young staff sergeant named Horace Evers was in Munich. This is May 1945. And he and his unit are rounding up the Nazi high command to try them as war criminals. They walk into this one apartment complex. It's absolutely palatial, chandeliers, gold carpeting, everything. And Evers realized that they have just stepped inside of Adolf Hitler's private Munich residence. Evers goes up to Hitler's desk, and there is Hitler's personal gold embossed stationery. And on that stationery, he wrote home to his parents about what he saw at the Dachau concentration camp. And because the project focuses on conflicts and moments in our history, going back from the revolution to the present day, we see these echoes and patterns over time. This is a letter written, 15 pages handwritten, by a young woman named Anna Miller, who witnessed one of the most horrific days in American history. A week after it happened, she wrote this letter home to her parents describing what she saw. She writes it almost as a short story, and she begins it by saying, "We were in a business meeting, and there were about 100 people in the audience and a speaker, and we suddenly hear this loud boom outside. And everyone stops, and they talk amongst themselves, and they realize it was probably construction that had fallen from the building next door because they had seen scaffolding when they walked in. So they go back to the meeting. But then gradually they start hearing sirens getting louder and louder, and people screaming outside. And finally someone says, 'Look, I don't mean to be rude, but can we look outside to see what's going on?' The minute they walk over these large bay windows and pull back the curtains, they watch the second plane hit the World Trade Center. They're in the hotel right next door below the World Trade Center. And Anna goes on, just like William Seiko, the young sailor inside the ship at Pearl Harbor, in moment-by-moment detail of what it felt like to be caught in the eye of the storm. And she goes on actually very explicitly about what they saw and how she was almost killed in the attack when the trade centers fell and they were rushing through the streets with everyone else and barely survived. I want to conclude with a letter just to prove that this generation of service members are writing things that are eloquent and as powerful as were written in wars previous. This is by a captain named Zoltan Krompecker, and he was going off to Iraq. And he realized that there was a chance that he might be killed in action. So he wrote a letter to his two young daughters, who were about 4 and 1 year old, to describe to them how much he loved them and to always remember him in the event that he didn't make it back. And he says, "Dear Leah and Annie, my precious little girls, I write this letter to you because soon I'll be leaving for Iraq, and your mom and I just tucked you into bed, read your books, and said our prayers together. I've been watching the news, and I'm worried that there might be the off chance I might never get to watch you board the school bus for the first time, place a Band-Aid on a scraped knee, or walk you down the aisle of your wedding. So if you're reading this years from now, I want you to know how very much your daddy loved you, and that I'm always watching over you and protecting you. You are my everything, and now I must say goodbye. I worry the next time you see me will be when you stand in front of my coffin wearing your Sunday best to say goodbye to a daddy you hardly knew. One night during this past December, I read you girls The Snowy Day. The next morning revealed 3 inches of fresh powder. That morning you greeted me with the plea, "Daddy, can we go outside and play like Peter did in the book?" I replied that I had to get to work, but maybe we could build a snowman after I returned home. Unfortunately, it was so dark by the time I returned that there was no time for snowmen or anything else. Last night, as I was putting you both to bed, Leah looked up and said, "Daddy, I have tears in my eyes because you'll be leaving. Annie, you must have realized that something was wrong because you started crying too. April has arrived and there's little evidence of the long winter. I put the sled away until next year. Winter is done and I'll leave for Iraq next month. I wish it would snow just one more time. Love, Daddy." So often these letters end on a sad note. In this case, it snowed a week later, and Zoltan Krompecker and his 2 daughters were able to play outside together. But most importantly, he came home alive. And he was actually able to donate this letter to us personally in San Antonio at Fort Sam Houston. When we think of war memorials and monuments, we often envision these grand structures of stone and steel. But for this project, we believe that these sometimes very fragile, delicate pieces of paper can represent among the most enduring and lasting tributes of the men and women who serve this country, as well as their families. And they remind us that they're not just sailors, airmen, soldiers, and Marines. They're somebody's parent, spouse, child, best friend, sibling, and that most of all, that their sacrifices extend beyond the battlefield. It's about not being there for an anniversary or for a time when a child is born. All those little things that they give up to serve this nation. And our mission is to preserve these experiences and these stories as only these service members can tell them. These are their words, and they capture their distinct personalities and voices like nothing else. And we hope that you can help us in this mission by either spreading the word, or if you have a war letter or email in your own family, and sharing it with us so that we can ensure that these stories are preserved for posterity. So I want to thank Morningside Ministries and mmlearn.org for helping us spread the message. And you can help us by also looking into your own archives or attics or basements to see if you have war letters or emails that you could share with us. And anyone can go to our website at warletters.us for more information on what this mission is all about and how to reach us. Thank you.